It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is broadcast number 460, September 28th, 1980, and side one of the tape if you are taping this program, or for those that get the tapes by subscription. If you want information on how to get past tapes, broadcasts, or current ones, or to subscribe to the series and own the cassettes, write to me at Post Office Box 22511, Carmel 93922, and I'll send you a list of past tapes going back to 1977 if you want them that far back, and you can select the subjects you're interested in. A few moments of discussion this evening, just a few on the Middle East crisis that's been developing the last few weeks. It flared up, and it seems to be calming, at least in the news this evening when I came to the studio. What we're witnessing in the Middle East is a no-win dilemma that I've been talking about, the dilemma since the hostages were taken. It's the sum total of all the mistakes of foreign policies that the United States and Great Britain and France, particularly Great Britain and the United States, have made in the Middle East in the past 60 years. It's the legacy of people like John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, Herbert Hoover, and many others who believed that the earth was ours to divide up for business and profit, and that people basically are expendable. And with that in mind, we sell arms and weapons to everybody and anybody and hope that if they just use them up fighting each other, we'll come out on top. But in the Middle East, where you have a large population that has never been studied by the United States, the Muslim people, or even in Asia, the Chinese people and the African people, Americans are not educated to understand the similarities of all these people with us. We're taught some of the differences, or mainly if we don't eat all our dinner, somebody in China is going to starve. That's about the extent of the social studies when we're growing up, or if we go to the beach and dig deep enough, we'll get to China. Outside of that, the mentality and the psychology and needs of those people are never fully understood, and therefore we make weapons to give to each of these countries as if they were little toys, and then think that something fruitful can come of all of that, and it doesn't. When the hostages were taken in Iran, we were impotent, we still are, to move one way or the other. There was an article in the New York News today. The U.S. has 8 reasons for not siding with Iraq, and I think the listing of those reasons are indicative of how we backed ourselves into this dilemma and how unable we are ever going to be to unwind the situation, at least the way that we're used to doing, of throwing in troops and fighting hand to hand. We can't do it in the Middle East. This article suggests that the collapse of Iran would shift the balance of power in the Middle East and Persian Gulf region. The balance is already shifted. When we depend upon oil and don't develop other energy sources, the only thing we can think to do is to go in, even with atomic weapons, and grab it. That just won't work any longer, and the balance of power has shifted out of the hands of the United States into the Middle East, and we sit and watch, scared, will our oil be cut off or not? Should we send in the planes? What should we do? Second reason for staying out of Iraq was that victory on the part of Iraq against Iran would increase the prestige of the Iraqi radical leaders in the Arab world and would sponsor terrorism against Israel and Egypt. We already have funded these countries, Syria and Iraq and Libya. We've funded Egypt and Israel. Saudi Arabia, the United States has supplied weapons to all of the countries. We've supported the terrorists. As I mentioned last week, we supported the PLO and the Arab group the CIA funded that killed the Israeli athletes in Munich, funded radical movements of Baader-Meinhof, the FALN, the SLA, which was a pseudo-radical group made up by the CIA here, but the international terrorism of Carlos, and I'll go into that a little bit, this Carlos the terrorist from Venezuela. Just this week, Jack Anderson came out with an article on how the CIA saved Carlos. If Anderson told the complete story, we armed Carlos and allowed his killings and massacres and the bombings at airports and the Japanese Red Brigade and so forth were all American CIA and Pentagon they were funding the terrorists and proclaiming terrorism as so dangerous that we had to increase our international police to combat them while we were arming them. So we have sponsored terrorism, and they know it, and that's why they're free to take any step they want, forward or backward, because they know that we have funded them before. Another reason for staying out of the fight, at least overtly, is that the President Hussein, the Iraqi president, may be willing to subvert the monarchy of Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing states. That's a dangerous problem. Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter would go in and support the Saudi Arabian monarchy, but the monarchies are probably as far out or going out as fast as Somoza or the Shah of Iran. Someday, because of their greed and the way they reign, they will be kicked out, and then the United States economy will fall to the investments all over the United States and all over the world will be in jeopardy if the land is taken by the people. And we've supported the wrong people in every country wherever we had a choice, and we have to face that consequence. Another explanation for not going in was that the United States wants to see the flow of oil from both Iran and Iraq resume as quickly as possible. It is that fact, the need for oil, that makes us so dependent that we can't take any step, and we have to stay off and watch whatever happens in the Middle East now, because we are dependent on that oil and, as I say, haven't developed our other energy sources. Another excuse is that Iraq, along with Libya and South Yemen, refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist. They're the only three nations that adhere to that position, and therefore we can't overtly help Iraq. But the Friends of the Middle East and John Connolly and the Clint Murchisons and the Texas oil men and Exxon and so forth, under the Friends of the Middle East and the CIA, have funded these organizations that have poked holes in Israel. Overtly, they support Israel, and not even so overtly, but under the table they have supported all of these radical groups, so that whether they gang together and go against Israel today or 10 years from now, the United States has armed these people knowing that that was their intent. Another argument is that Iraq is distanced from the Soviet Union, and if we interfere with them, they will press the United States to remove troops from Portugal, Spain, Greece, and Turkey. When the United States becomes so dependent upon oil, then the Middle Eastern countries can dictate to us, get out of Greece, get out of Turkey, get out of Spain and Portugal. So long as we have armed them, so long as we have supported the terrorists, so long as we have looked the other way and allowed people like Carlos to do multiple assassinations and murders, they own us just through blackmail alone and through oil, so that oil and blackmail make us totally dependent upon whatever move they make, we have to go along with. And then another argument was that Iraq victory over Iran would assure the death of the hostages. I don't think the hostages will be killed, but we've armed every country in the Middle East. We hope they'll sell us oil. We hope they won't line up with the Soviet Union. And now we have to sit immobilized and just wait upon their decisions of what moves they're going to take next. Interesting articles in the paper this week. One, Ronald Reagan says Carter's to blame for the Iran-Iraq war, that we should have kept the Shah in. I don't think it's up to the United States to make decisions who should be the head of state of every country. And it's that mentality of Reagan that goes back to the John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Herbert Hoover mentality, the foreign advisors of Reagan that think if we keep the Shah in, we will control the Middle East. Those days are over. One man isn't going to take care of a whole area for us. And if his Savak and secret police are not wanted, there's no amount of police that are going to be able to support the puppets that we put in. Eventually, they're going to have to topple, and the United States will topple with them. There was another article in the San Jose Mercury this week. Iranian students at Stanford believe that the U.S. is helping Iraq. The Iranian student said the fact is that the United States is really behind the war. It's supporting many Iranian exiles who are helping Iraq needle Iran. The United States wants to divide up Iran into three main sections that they mentioned. The ultimate aim is the Persian Gulf, the oil. Another article, this is from Germany, UPI, 70,000 exiled Iranians are ready to pounce upon Iran. They're in West Germany. That's our ally, a NATO country. Jimmy Carter says we'll stay aloof. We won't interfere in the Middle East, and yet we work with the NATO country, and over there's a group of Iranians in exile, some 45,000 soldiers who are waiting to go over the border and recapture the country. They worked with the twin sister of the late Shah of Iran, the Princess Ashraf, in Paris, and they're hoping someday that they'll all be over and they can get it back into Iran and get their country back in their hands. When they finally arrive over there, I believe that there will be bloody warfare, and it will be on the hands and conscience or mind of the United States that set up that puppet government, got rid of Mossadegh, and took the oil for the American corporations, Standard Oil, Exxon, Morgan Guaranty Trust, Chase Manhattan, the large United States banking firms, and the intelligence community thought that in return for putting a man on the throne and giving him all the weapons he needed to stay on that throne, he would invest money in America, sell his oil. And by manipulating these people with our desires for business and profit and calling it national security, we've put ourselves in this position. This country would be much more secure if we did the right thing sometimes, because it's the wrong things that are leading us to national insecurity all over the world. I just have a few headlines of this week's news that I thought were horrendous, and I thought I'd just run them down real fast. The most pathetic thing is the trial of Kim Dae-jung, I guess you pronounce it, in Korea. He's been given the death penalty, and there are many articles deploring the fact that this man might be hung for his position in trying to get an elected government into power in Korea. We sent soldiers over there in 1950. The United States supported a war in South Korea that worked itself into a military dictatorship, and agents were paying off our members of Congress and still are so heavily that we really have no control over the South Korean government. There's an article in the New York Times this week saying that the position of the military court in sentencing this man to be hung demonstrates the bankruptcy of the United States policy towards South Korea. An article by Jerome Allen Cohn that Jimmy Carter talked about human rights and so forth, and here is a General Chun Du-Hwang who literally shot his way to power, violated the United Nations command structure, took illegitimate use of troops for his own sake, jailed Mr. Kim to prevent widely popular presidential elections, and now has ordered Mr. Kim to be hung. His only crime was that in 1971 he almost unseated Mr. Park. The new president of South Korea doesn't want that kind of competition and has ordered Kim Dae-jung to be hung. If that is allowed, that means that the puppet governments that America puts into power, such as Mr. Pinochet in Chile, allowing Allende to be murdered, and American corporations having a large part in the role of the murder of Allende, and then Mr. Park being killed in Korea, and this fascist dictator taking over South Korea, it means that the American policy has totally failed in terms of anything that the American dream or goals or aim was in terms of democratic government. That we have allowed dictatorships in many countries, approximately 77, to go into power, and supported them with the weapons and the necessary instruments to keep their power and keep people enslaved in those countries. The Somoza killing that I talked about last week is still not solved, except for the one Lee Harvey Oswald type patsy that was shot on the spot. And again, it gives an excuse to go into the labor leaders and round up people in Argentina and in Paraguay, political activists, on the possibility that they killed Somoza. They sacrificed Somoza at this time and could continue to round up political activists. Ronald Reagan was asked why his top aides were around South America with the dictators. This was in the New York Times. And one top aide, Roger Fontaine, talked about being in Chile and how he wants to strengthen the ties between Argentina, Chile, and South Africa. That's just what we need, is Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and South Africa in an alliance. Reagan's advisors want a closer cooperation of those countries, and also they would include Mexico. They said the only country that would be treated as an enemy by Ronald Reagan would be Cuba. And here's a quotation from Mr. Fontaine, his aide. He said, "We must maintain our interest in promoting democracy without getting disillusioned if there is a military coup in Honduras. The United States cannot be the judge of the whole world and of the Americas in particular. We keep reprimanding other republics because they misbehave. This is where hundreds of thousands of people are murdered and missing and tortured, and he uses the word misbehave. And Reagan's advisor went on to say that he wouldn't cut off support from Bolivia, the new military dictatorship, as Jimmy Carter did, that he would go along in a more passive way and not criticize them for taking power the way they did, overthrowing an elected government just a few months later and putting in a military dictatorship. Mr. Reagan's advisor said, in quotes, democracy in some cases can be instituted too rapidly. And he used Bolivia as an example. You want me to talk about presidential candidates? I think this gives you an inkling of what Ronald Reagan thinks and what will happen if he's president of the United States. He will approve of every military dictatorship, put down the labor movements, call all the activists radicals and communists, and allow them to be decimated, wiped out, while the heads of states take away the freedom of the press and free speech in all of these countries. Daniel Ellsberg was on the Monterey Peninsula this week talking to the Bar Association. He said the country hasn't been told the first full story of nuclear accidents, that there have been at least 30 serious accidents that could have led to nuclear explosions in this country. He knew about them when he worked for Rand Corporation, and once again, the government is lying. The court in Chicago told the families of the DC-10, that crash in Chicago in 1979, that they could be awarded damages. There's over 100 lawsuits against the DC-10 airline, the airlines that made this airplane. And the condition was that they had to prove that the passengers suffered seconds before their death. The U.S. District Court Judge Herbert L. Hill said it would be difficult to prove this because there were no survivors. But if anyone could prove that a member of their family suffered before he or she died, they'd consider the case. But Illinois isn't bound to any court settlements if they can't prove that the person suffered. And being as the plane crashed, and all of these people went instantly when it blew up, 274 people, it's up to the family to prove that in the last 10 seconds they suffered. And as there are no witnesses, what a catch-22 that is. In terms of employment in Maryland this week, there's a Social Security opening, 75 jobs, and 26,200 people applied for 75 jobs. The University of California voted to keep the laboratories open to nuclear research. Governor Brown tried to stop it. He said out here that this Lawrence Livermore lab has a laboratory that does what it wants. It's free of university control. It's free of state control. It cannot be controlled by the President of the United States or government high officials or Congress. Another article out of Damascus, Arkansas. One gentleman was in trouble 2 years ago. There was a big orange cloud from the same missile silo that exploded just a few weeks ago. 20 of his cows died. He had severe headaches, and then he was hospitalized 30 times in the last 32 months. Terribly ill and suffering a second time from the exposure. Their panel of scientists are clashing over cloning. At the University of California, I mentioned that briefly once before, down in La Jolla, a Dr. Kennedy was making a virus. They didn't know whether he was doing it deliberately or by mistake or keeping poor records or having lapse of memory, but he was cloning some dangerous viruses with discrepancies in laboratory experiments, and 4 people that worked in the lab told about him because they felt their life was in danger or he was endangering people, and they've left the lab to work somewhere else. An article about the suicide of James Dallas Egbert III. I never did talk about that brilliant student that was missing from Detroit, Michigan. He went on down to Texas. There was a big secret about this boy. He had a high IQ, listed at 145. Now there's an article that came out in the New York Times. Youth suicide may lead to help to other children who are brilliant but troubled. I knew there was more to the Egbert story. There were a lot of secrets of where he was when he was missing and who he was with and how the Dallas, Texas investigator found him. But after he got back to Detroit, he was dead this summer with a bullet in his brain. Now they're saying that he's a springboard for research and that they're going to test a lot of children. High percentage of children that are dropouts are gifted, that these gifted children show signs of it by the 3rd grade, and they're quoting Louis Terman from Stanford with his gifted children's test. I think of the testing of the Whitman boys' brains in Texas after the shooting at the tower there as an excuse for Dr. Irwin and Dr. Martin Sweet to test the brains of bright people, scientists, inventors, blacks, to see what causes violence, not social conditions, and so forth. So it seems that this young person who died attending the university very young is what they called a springboard for research. So from there, whatever mysteries were going on with his poor Egbert, he's now going to be the subject excuse for studying young people and their brains, and goodness knows what these studies will entail. Speaking of bright people, there's a mail order now catalog for Nobel sperm you can order. You can breed superior children and become impregnated. You have to prove at the Germinal Choice in Escondido, California, that you have a high IQ. And if you have a high IQ and belong to Mensa, a club for people with the highest IQs, you're eligible for the recipient of free Nobelist sperm. There's a woman in New York who wrote, I'm well-adjusted, childless, and I'm a Mensa woman. Mensa meaning she's passed the IQ test. She's a Yale lawyer who wants the sperm of a Nobel scientist. It's free for ordering from a catalog if you have the IQ. Los Angeles is afraid of toxic waste. They're now worrying about where the lifeguards are at the beach and also other parts of town. There's 11 existing places of landfill where people are getting leukemia. A lifeguard at the beach, a storm drain that was filled with contaminated chemicals, and the lifeguards are getting cancer. It seems that in Whittier and other places in Los Angeles County, there was a multi-million-dollar commercial service that was supposed to dispose of hazardous waste 2 years ago, and they were supposed to have their license revoked, and it wasn't revoked. Now the cost of the cleanup is into millions into West Covina and at the beach at Whittier. Goodness knows about the people swimming in the beach as well as the lifeguards. Another article this week, U.S. airmen buoyed by readiness gains. Units in West Germany are having a high percentage of planes. They're ready for combat for World War III. They're using F-15s, F-16s, F-4G, EF-111s. Every weapon has a letter and a number and squadron, and they're flying and dropping out of the air, and they're already testing for World War III. I really just can't imagine the mentality of people getting ready for this each new generation, but it does happen, and that's why I'm reading you these headlines. Peking police want equipment from the United States. One more dictatorship. A New York Times article says they want to fight crime. They want to buy from our laboratory equipment, the special police. The Chinese government still has entrenched patterns of harassment, arbitrary arrests, police punishment, harsh punishment, no trial, no political dissent. Prisoners are taken to large remote areas, large prison system, numerous labor camps. The police system monitors political activity of Chinese citizens, and they make fun of the slogan human rights. They say that's a bourgeois slogan. They've now asked the United States to supply them with the police techniques that we have given to all the other countries like Costa Rica and Panama and Chile and Uruguay and Paraguay and Bolivia and Argentina and you name it. We've sent police torture equipment for interrogation all over the world, manufactured in the United States of America, and now Beijing, China, wants the equipment. They claim if we have a fingerprinting process, we won't have to squeal out of them with torture a confession. We can find out whether they're guilty or not. Just send us your fingerprinting process and the technology, and we can then find the criminal. Well, it's very much like solving the Kennedy assassination or any other murders in the United States. When fingerprints don't match or aren't visible on a weapon, such as Lee Harvey Oswald had, when there's no fingerprints, they just say he killed the president anyway. You don't need fingerprints in this country to solve a crime. You just kill the defendant 2 days after he's charged with the crime, and there's no physical evidence to link him to the crime. So if it works here, it works in China, and you don't have to ship equipment back and forth. Another article, Ronald Reagan doesn't want any more debates. He's through debating. He refuses to meet Jimmy Carter one-on-one. Another article on toxic shock, tampons giving cancer, the Tampax giving cancer. We export Nestle's formula all over the world that is taking the lives of babies in impoverished third world countries. We sent Trish that fabric that causes cancer out of the country and it's not allowed here, so we send it to the poor all over the world, and now Tampax is causing fatal diseases. I have one basic rule about clothing or anything on my body. It's either cotton, wool, linen, and silk, and that's it. No synthetics. I've never had them. I don't own them, and you shouldn't either. Just stick to the basics and stay away from as many synthetics as you can. It's hunting season in this country. It's getting more overt. I remember at the time when Mr. Oakes, the Indian leader, was shot in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and the defendant said he was told by the police it was open hunting season for niggers and Indians. Article just this week, Associated Press, Buffalo, New York is hunting the gunman of blacks. A white killer's on the loose. He is he shot 3 black men and a black teenager. They have a feeling that he's out for black people, that he's killing at random. This is the cover line always. He's killing at random, but he seems to be a person with a hatred for black men. Now, random killing, we're getting random shootings and attempted murders in San Francisco and other cities. The word random isn't right. They're shooting for blacks. Random is when you don't make a choice. But when you specifically go for blacks, that isn't random killing. It may mean you don't care which black you kill, but it still has a specific goal that you want, just as when Dr. Marcus Foster was killed by the SLA. He was black, he died, he had cyanide bullet. His companion, who was white, had a regular bullet and survived. They didn't intend for the black man to live. There were several joggers in Salt Lake City last week, it was about 3 weeks ago, that were gunned down. Again, a random killing. The only thing that was unusual about it, and it's never been solved, was that the people that were murdered were black, and the man or the persons that shot at them, the police believed were white. They were joggers, and they were killed in Salt Lake City. There's a trial going on in Oakland now of a woman who killed a small black boy, and she said she wanted to eat black children. She hated them so much she wanted to eat them. At first, the press was kept out of the trial, and then the story came out of her intense hatred of black people. Another article, well, I mentioned it before, the sniper in San Francisco. Second sniper attack on Muni bus. Picture of Eddie Wells, a black man. The San Francisco Chronicle says the sniping appears to be a random thing. He was running his bus along the usual line when somebody just shot at him, and earlier in the week somebody was shooting at a Muni bus, also airport bus carrying passengers, and they were shooting superficial head wounds at the driver. Again, as I say, it's a random shooting, but the victims are black. Another story, Hearst land yields pot. San Luis Obispo, the Hearst Ranch, Randolph Hearst Ranch in San Simeon, there was a pot cache they were growing. As if there isn't enough money or time to get your grass somewhere else, they discovered crops at the Hearst Castle, a 500-plant field valued at $200,000. And at the same time, a while ago, just next to there was a $1.2 million field next to the Hearst property of marijuana. So they're kind of petty, just a $30,000 crop arrest at this time. But it's strange that they have to have this growing on the territory. You'd think that that wouldn't really be necessary. Fidel Castro is angry because in Venezuela the court decision was to acquit 4 men accused of bombing a Cuban airline, and 73 people were killed in 1976. The Cuban airline was, the anti-Castro Cubans admitted they blew up the airplane, and the courts in Venezuela acquitted the 4 suspects, including Dr. Orlando Bosch, who works with the anti-Castro Cubans and the CIA that were part of the Letelier, Ronnie Moffat murder that I mentioned last week, the anniversary of their murder, just last week, September 21st. Castro has pulled out his agents from Venezuela, and he's very angry, and rightfully so. You see, the courts aren't working, and these people are just walking away. These so-called terrorists, the terror on the right, are not going into courts anywhere in the world. They're walking out of France, England, Germany, Venezuela, the United States, free to do more killings. It's 30 minutes now. I'm going to take a break so you can turn your cassette over and we can arrange to do that with ours. And I'll be back on the air in about 30 seconds.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
This is part 2 of World Watchers. It's Mae Brussell. I just want to bring up a few more points and get back to a very controversial subject that I completed the broadcast with last week. There was an Oktoberfest massacre in Germany, a meeting in Munich, Germany, a fall festival of people, and 12 people were killed this last week and 144 were wounded. There was a large sniping at the crowd, and a woman claimed to belong to a right-wing extremist group that tore into the crowd at the beer festival. One of their own members was killed, and they were hoping, of course, to probably blame it on the left, but then this woman was weak and said that the far right wing were behind it. There was Gundolf Kohler. He's a banned Nazi leader. He's a member of a banned group, and there are many Nazis at the meeting, the Oktoberfest, and by gunning them down and trying to blame it on the left, it would get sympathy for the right movement. The same party that confessed to this said that they're linked to the bombings in Bologna, Italy, the train station massacre where 83 people were killed last month. For some reason, the far right wing enjoys just killing into the mass, into the scene, to create terror and uncertainty so that people won't know which way to turn and will plead with the police to settle their matters. The violence in the United States, the terrorist groups that were here when Ronald Reagan was governor, and I'll get to those in a minute, were done against people at random, most of them at random, again, killed, but the people who were charged with the killing were selected carefully and trained carefully, and it was a connived thing. It wasn't done spontaneously by a person who just went crazy. There was an article this week, also UPI story, 2 Chicago policemen are suspected of manufacturing silencers in their homes. They put them on .22 caliber automatic pistols and sell them to the mob hitmen in Chicago. The Chicago Sun-Times reported. They seized the equipment of Patrolman Richard Madega, a silencer equipped with a .22 automatic and a .38 caliber machine gun. The men resigned from the police force because they were giving the Chicago mobsters silencers to go out and kill. Unfortunately, I think we will see a race war in this country. I think if there's unlimited weapons and the police work with the mob and are racist, you're going to have to face up to the fact of a race war in this country as the Klan and the Nazis, the Minutemen, arm. They're dead set on stopping any movement socially of blacks or minorities into the mainstream of our lives. And so is the middle class, and so is the upper class that funds them. They are the buffer between the Wall Street board members who supply these people with the Noxie and the know-how and the equipment and the police protection to do what they're doing, and the police departments are part of it. Last week, speaking of violence on the right, instead of digressing to other news articles I did want to get into, I ended the program talking about the death of Robert Linkletter's son, a controversial subject. News story, wasn't in many papers, maybe a 1-inch story in a lot of papers. Robert Linkletter, 35, son of entertainer Art Linkletter, died from injuries in a traffic accident in West Los Angeles. The woman who went into him has not been charged. No charges have been filed. The case remains under investigation. It went on to say, Linkletter lost a daughter, Diane, when she leaped to her death at the age of 20 in 1969 under the influence of LSD. The husband of another Linkletter daughter committed suicide 3 months later. Well, I have a copy of a letter here that was mailed. The woman has her address, so she's not shy to put it down. She has her address and telephone number. And she wrote this in 1971 to attention Judge Charles Franick. He was the judge who was attending to the trials up in the Santa Cruz area. He was the judge for all 3 trials of Robert Frazier, Herbert Mellon, and Edmund Kemper. And I don't want to go into all the details of each trial, but just briefly to show some of the terror on the right and how it came down in California and continues all over the world at this time. This woman wrote a letter to Judge Franek and also to the Redwood City Tribune, and she said, finally, the LA Times had a story about the trial of the murder of the Odas and their secretary. That is a doctor, he prescribed glasses, who lived in the Santa Cruz area, and I'll go into the Oda murder just briefly in a second. This woman said, you asked if I was certain if it was Frazier with Robert Linkletter in Woodland Hills less than a month prior to those killings. She goes on to say that he was wearing glasses. The van that Robert was driving, I recall, this was not printed in the Times. I have reason to believe Robert, this is Linkletter, was driving north last Thursday. And if you're observant, you saw him snickering in the courtroom, watching how his murders are being taken care of. There, the man Frazier, John Frazier, who was charged with Oda killing, is trying to find at the rear of the courtroom, does Frazier know about the organization of killers called the International White Guard? Does he fear his wife will be killed if he were to name Robert Linkletter, and he mentions other members of the family, who Diane Linkletter was hearing this honorable organization of killers? Robert was also identified as the Zodiac Killer by his sister 3 days before her death. She had read his first message that was partly coded. I never could believe she committed suicide any more than her brother-in-law, John Zweyer, did. She said she had been shot by Robert. Both Diane and John were witnesses the night of the Tate murder. John did turn down, it goes into about a bribery that was offered him that he turned down in details of the killings. Robert is about 27, and that would jive. This was written in, as I say, 1971, and then it would fit in with his age at this particular time. He was 27, she goes on. He wears a wig, and sometimes he looks almost bald. He lets his beard grow and so forth, and he has different wig lengths. And I knew him as both Robert Linkletter and the Zodiac when he was in Los Angeles. And this woman goes into that she drove a school bus and that she used to see him in Van Nuys and Ventura, and that she knew him. And she said, you should check his fingerprints with Dr. Oda and the glasses that were prescribed that he lost the night of the Tate murders. The night that Sharon Tate and the other people at her home were killed, allegedly Charles Manson was charged with the crimes but was never in the house. It was Charles Watson. There were glasses found on the floor of the house that have inside the house that were never admitted. Nobody ever traced those glasses who prescribed them or who they belonged to. They didn't belong to any member of the Manson family that was in the house. They didn't belong to any member of Sharon Tate's entourage that were killed. Now, I called David Tosche. He was the police investigator in San Francisco in 1976, and asked him if he had ever heard any allegations that this person was linked to the Zodiac Killer. The reason I bring this up now is that the killing of Robert Linkletter, his death at this time, is very important because all of these violences were directly linked to the people around Ronald Reagan and his counterintelligence group with Sheriff Peter Pitchess, Evel Younger, Los Angeles Police Chief Ed Davis. The whole CIA Operation Chaos, the FBI COINTEL program, was concentrated into mass violences in California that were directly linked to Ronald Reagan in Sacramento at the time. And I had called David Tosche and asked him if he had ever heard about these allegations or the name of this person linked to the Zodiac Killer. And he said, yes, we had his name 5 years ago. And I wrote this down. I don't remember. I don't think I tape recorded our conversation, but I wrote it as he said it. I said, was this ever cleared? He said, no, it was never cleared. And I said, was he ever arrested or charged? He said, no, we're not asking him any questions about it. Well, that was in 1976 that this conversation went on. In 1978, that was 2 years later, David Tosche was removed from the San Francisco Police Department because he was caught writing Zodiac notes to the San Francisco Chronicle, impersonating the Zodiac Killer himself. Whoever was the Zodiac had disappeared or worked with the San Francisco Police Department, and Police Inspector David Toschi was removed from investigating the Zodiac murder case because there were doubts about the authenticity of the latest letters, and he was never charged, and there were secret hearings, and it was covered up why the San Francisco Police Department would be involved in this kind of terrorism in California in any way. The chief investigator would be simulating letters. Interesting enough that the Zodiac killer first began writing letters in 1969. He confessed to 3 murders, and then later in 1969 he confessed to another murder, and by 1971 he had sent letters to the San Francisco Chronicle that he had done 12. But in 1969 he wrote to Melvin Belli, the attorney in San Francisco, and said, "I wish you a Merry Christmas. I want you to help me. I cannot reach out for help because things in me won't let me. I find it extremely difficult to hold back and check. Will you help me?" Now, I've mentioned Melvin Belli many times. He's the attorney for Hermann Goering's wife, the widow, the Nazi, Hermann Goering. He's her attorney right now. He was attorney for Jack Ruby at the time that John Kennedy was killed and Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald, attorney for Errol Flynn, charged with being a Nazi spy, attorney for the Hells Angels that worked closely with the Oakland police and the CIA, and far right-wing organizations of terror. Melvin Belli was the person that, whoever the Zodiac was earlier, he wrote to him for some help. It's interesting because when James Earl Ray was arrested in London for the charge of killing Martin Luther King, he asked for Mr. Haynes, the attorney. Mr. Haynes was a CIA attorney, acknowledged he worked with the CIA. He was active with the Bay of Pigs, the anti-Castro Cubans, the same people linked to the killing of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. And when James Earl Ray was in London, he asked for the help of Mr. Haynes of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Zodiac killer asked for Melvin Belli. Ed Sanders, who wrote a book on the family called The Family, The Story of the Manson Affair, knew that I was doing investigations into these California violences. And in 1974, he wrote a letter to Paul Krasner, who had published my article, The SLA is the CIA. He said, this is part of his letter to Paul Krasner in March of 1974, "I've been totally involved preparing an article on the Santa Cruz murders for Esquire. With regards to Herbert Mullen and Mae Brussell's contention regarding zombie electrodes possibly implanted in Hawaii, I have obtained some documents regarding his psychiatric treatment there, the doctors who supposedly treated him, an indication he was involved in religious rites and was receiving some kind of treatment in Maui, M-A-U-I. Regarding the John Fraser case, that's the Oda case in Santa Cruz, and which brought in the Zodiac case, I've become personally convinced that he was suckered into the event. Dr. Oda had $250,000 invested with Sharpies in San Jose, supposedly operating a Louisiana-based oil company, and they were burning him. By examining 2,000 or 3,000 pages of reports and interview transcripts regarding Fraser, I can't help but believe that he was set up to do it, but proving it is another thing." Now, whether he was set up or whether somebody else did it and he was the patsy, it will take a long time to know. I've been corresponding with John Fraser, and it's in prison at Folsom. We've been corresponding for a long time. The last card I got from him was this last June, 1980, and at the bottom of the card he said, "You suggested that when finished with your book, you would write to me. I was working on a book, and I still am, and I owe him a letter. Hopefully it is only because you've been busy that you haven't written to me. Meanwhile, a word about Jim Jones and the CIA. But for now, there are no experimental techniques going on in Folsom. They are not necessary because of our isolation. Take care, John." I do get word from inside the prisons. Between 1970 and 1973, and this was just the interim before Jim Jones rented the property down in Guyana for experimentation and mind control, up till 1973, in that 3-year period, Santa Cruz County was referred to as the murder capital of the world. Between allegedly John Fraser, Edmund Kemper, and Herbert Mullen, 26 people were killed during this time period, and Judge Charles Franich had tried all the cases. A man from Stanford Research linked to mind control programs, Donald Lund, wrote a small book called Murder and Madness, put out by the Stanford Alumni Association. He referred to the murders in America. He said from 1970 through 1974, more Americans were killed in the United States than during the entire Vietnam War. These were the statistics of murder. As far as other countries, the United States has the most dramatic rise, about 100% in murders. That doesn't equal anything in any other country. In October 1970, just almost an anniversary, 10 years almost to the day, John Fraser was allegedly the person who killed a prominent eye surgeon. There was Dr. Oda, his wife, 2 sons, their secretary, 1 man, a hippie type, who carried tarot cards, the Knight of Wands, the Knight of Cups, the Knight of Pentacles, and so forth on his dashboard. 1 person was supposed to have bound up each one of these people and shot them, and their bodies were discovered, and the house was set on fire. The bodies were in a pool, and John Fraser was charged with these murders. There was a getaway car. There were 2 men in a car. There was every reason to believe that it was another person. If Fraser was there at all, there was another person involved, but Fraser didn't do these murders. But he was framed for them, and he's serving 5 life sentences in prison right now. There's some good articles in New West. I got a batch of them at a book sale, and I have them filed in separate compartments according to subject matter, but I just picked up a couple of old copies this morning. As a matter of fact, one, The Power Politician Behind the Badge, and it has Ed Davis on the cover. December 1977, the chief of police who would be king. Ed Davis and criminal conspiracy section of Los Angeles were making up many of the conspiracies in the state at the time. And I'm emphasizing the California violences because this was Reagan's shtick. He was the governor when all this was going on, and very much part of the mind control team, and working with them carefully as we were going through the criminal conspiracy section, planning conspiracies. The Sheriff Peter Pitch's behind the violences in Los Angeles at La Bianca and the Sharon Tate and the Isla Vista, and the Mayday moratoriums. It goes on, the California violences. There's another story I want to do with you that covers a later time period, but the same people involved. That's the Hillside Strangler that involves going up to Bellingham, Washington, a police cop that worked here in Fort Orange, out here in Seaside, California, the LAPD, and Mr. Kenneth Bianchi, and how he fixed up prominent politicians with women. And then after they have sex, you see, they can be murdered, and they make snuff movies, pornographic movies of them being killed, and then they can't blackmail or frame the politicians, so you sell the movies besides. You fix up the politicians, use decals on your car. They give you special privileges to pull up, snuff the women out, throw them by the side of the street, and then bring in more women. California is ripe with violences. New York had its Son of Sam, the same ilk, the same kind of a combine of police and counterintelligence and terror for a whole year in the city. But this kind of violence is something that has not yet been exposed and should be exposed because it will increase tenfold, just as international terrorism on the right continues, because it has never stopped, and the courts don't prosecute these people or hold them down. They're released, and by their being released, they're free to go out and do more crimes. Speaking of release, the People's Temple had let out Charles Beekman. They had a lot of pressure down in Guyana with the government down there, and Mr. Beekman's trial has been dropped, and the trial against Larry Layton has been dropped, and they've been released after 2 years. They want to come home to the United States and forget about all the deaths in Jonestown or the cutting of the throats of Mrs. Amos and the girls down there. Luckily, the House panel is going to investigate the Jonestown bloodbath. There was an article in the paper this week that the House, again, the House Intelligence Committee, is once more going into the allegations about Jonestown. Joe Holsinger, the aide for Leo Ryan, has asked for this investigation. And when it's inevitable that they go into it, then Jack Anderson gets on the bandwagon. It's 2 years, almost 2 years since the Jonestown massacre, but this week Jack Anderson had an article, and he's a trial balloon. When he puts something out, that means it's going to go forward. He wrote this week there's a $3 million lawsuit by the children of the late Leo Ryan. They're charging the State Department withheld information that could have prevented the murder of Leo Ryan. The House Intelligence Committee is going into disturbing allegations that, one, the CIA activities in Guyana were so great and the CIA had links to Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Two, the CIA agent may have witnessed Ryan's assassination and then went back to the camp to see the murder of the 900 men, women, and children. The third allegation is the proof that the State Department knew of the danger that Leo Ryan was going to and didn't tell him. Jack Anderson said that Richard Dwyer, and this is what Joel Holsinger has been saying, the CIA agent, was at the airport when Ryan was killed, and when Jim Jones was about to die, he yelled, it's on the microphone, on the FBI tapes, "Get Dwyer out of here before something happens to him. I'm not talking about you, Darrell. I said Dwyer." And Jack Anderson wrote, Dwyer was deputy chief of the U.S. mission in Guyana. And this is the interesting thing about the Jack Anderson article. He said, Who's Who in the CIA, he referred to a book, Who's Who in the CIA, a reliable East German publication, mentioned that Richard Dwyer has been an agent since 1959. Now that little book, Who's Who in the CIA, lists Mr. Rudolph Winokur, the chief historian for the Warren Commission, who set the men to write the Warren Report. He's listed in the book, Who's Who in the CIA. Bill Moyer is listed in the book, Who's Who in the CIA. John McVicker, the man from the Soviet embassy that was responsible for Tsarist Marina Oswald to come to the United States, is written in the Who's Who in the CIA. Richard Snyder, the man in the embassy that worked with Lee Harvey Oswald of Navy Intelligence, is written in the book Who's Who in the CIA. When Jack Anderson begins to quote that little red book, which I got from East Germany and other researchers have had for many years, when he begins to quote that as being a reliable source, he better then get on to the other contacts of Lee Harvey Oswald with the Soviet Union and Marina Oswald, because all of their contacts there were with the Central Intelligence Agency, with Priscilla Johnson, with McVicker, with Snyder, and then, of course, Bill Moyer, the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson after Kennedy was killed. Jack Anderson went on to say that Jonestown commune had large supplies of Quaaludes, Valium, Demerol, Thorazine, with links of Jones possibly to drug trafficking, organized crime, plus law enforcement agencies. Now, that is the problem that we have in the United States. It's more important than talking about whether Jimmy Carter is going to win or Ronald Reagan is going to win. What is happening in our country is something that we have to become aware of and pressure them to do something, whoever wins the presidency. Both candidates come out of the same fabric. They're not going to go into anything unless they're forced to. They don't care who killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. They don't care about political assassinations, mind control, poisoning, pollution, exploitation, the Klan, the Nazis. They're only going to care as much as you care. If lifeguards are getting cancer, soldiers are getting cancer, Agent Orange, if the Klan is armed, it's up to you to tell them what you think should happen. It doesn't really matter which one becomes president. They'll only move as far as you want them to do. That is the truth. And so the main thing is not who is going to win the presidency, but what do you want them to do with it. When Jack Anderson makes a statement that Jim Jones' operation was involved, A, drug traffic, B, organized crime, C, law enforcement, and D, the CIA, you have that recipe and formula that I talk about every week for the past 9 years on radio programs. The federal government, the Central Intelligence Agency, law enforcement, which includes the State Department, the FBI, the local police, the San Francisco police that were giving arms to Jim Jones, Stanford Research, the doctors and scientists. When you get the mob, the drug traffickers, the police, and the intelligence community, you have a combine that unless you overthrow it in some way and look at them as having invaded your territory or your privacy as a private citizen, unless you recognize that that combine goes all the way from early rearming after World War I up to the present, gun smuggling, narcotics, federal agencies, and the intelligence community, unless you can break them apart some way, you are going to have to be victims of whatever oppressions or poisonings that they want to give to you. That is the Combine. I came across them one by one as I unraveled the Kennedy assassination, starting with the federal agencies that covered up the killing of John Kennedy, the FBI, the CIA, Navy intelligence, the local police department. And then in comes the mob, the links of Earl Warren and Richard Nixon, organized crime, and the anti-Castro Cubans that had organized crime control down in Cuba and wanted back the gaming tables, the Vegas crowd, Mo Dallas, and the crime syndicate involved, Genovesa and that group, and Robert Mayhew and Rosselli and Carlos Gambino, and you get organized crime with the federal agents. And the drug trafficking comes in. These criminals are given the freedom to do drug trafficking in exchange for helping with the assassinations of presidents and heads of states, and the intelligence community can weave Lee and Marina Oswald in and out of their particular agencies into Dallas with the intelligence community, George de Mohrenschildt of the CIA, and Max Clark, and George Bowie, and Paul Rygotorodsky, and John Conley. When you weave those elements into an assassination to kill the President of the United States, and then you study what preceded it and what followed it, you can understand how just a test case of massacres down in Jonestown are nothing. Jimmy Carter said at the time that over 900 people died, mostly poor and black, and approximately 130, 170 left who were white and slick and set up assassination teams and knew the way out, took the boats out, could get over to Venezuela, could get to Matthews Ridge, could go to Barbados. They got out. They flew to Florida. They flew into the United States. The poor black were dead and put face down, and Jimmy Carter said, let's not overreact. I have a friend who said she wouldn't vote for Carter just for that one thing at the time of Jonestown, because it's indicative of how he protects American citizens and allows gun running, smuggling, narcotics, experimentation, and so forth. It was important that Jack Anderson made this leap from Jonestown to the intelligence community, and I'm dwelling on it at length instead of covering a lot of other material because it's important. As I say, he's a trial balloon, and the congressional committees are not through with Jonestown. They're going to investigate, again, the links of the CIA to Burnham, the overthrow. There was a coup in Guyana years earlier, and Burnham was put in by the United States corporations. Jim Jones worked with them. Georgetown has the largest air base in South America. The CIA was sending troops to Angola. Larry Layton, who was released from jail, was a mercenary for the CIA troops to Angola. Thank goodness the Congressional Committee will do some work, and what they don't do, somebody else will do later. It's like the Kennedy assassination. The pieces will be put together in time, and we'll find the same recipe for all of the terrible crimes that have been happening to other people. The main thing is to stay alert so they don't rub off and start happening to us. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care this week. Our time is up, and I'll be back with you next week on KLRB.